So we are very, very fortunate to be hearing from Professor Stephen Osofsky today. When I reached out to him to ask him to speak at this forum, I expected no response, let alone a positive one. So thank you so much, Professor Osofsky. We're really excited to hear from you. Professor Osofsky is a professor at the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University, and his work is highly applicable to many of us in this forum. So without further ado, I will hand over to him. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Can you hear me okay, Melissa, everybody?
Yes, and we can see your presentation perfectly.
And Dennis will flip roles. I was hoping you would set the One Health table for me, but that's okay. So thanks so much to you all for having me here today. My talk is called Beyond Fences, Policy Options for Wildlife, Livelihoods, and Transboundary Animal Disease Management in Southern Africa. This is obviously a zebra dead along a fence, and this is the type of thing I saw all too commonly when I first got to Botswana in 1991 to become the first wildlife veterinary officer for the Botswana Department of Wildlife and National Parks. But the story I want to share with you today really goes back to the late 1950s, when the countries we're going to be talking about were all protectorates or colonies. So Botswana was the British protectorate of Bechuanaland, and Namibia had been under German auspices, and then after World War I, South African auspices. Zimbabwe was British Southern Rhodesia, and colonial powers in those days, as colonial powers do, were looking for economic traction. And one of the things they wanted to do was export beef from Southern Africa to Europe. But even in the late 1950s, they knew that the foot and mouth disease viruses resided in the African buffalo. The African buffalo is the only wildlife species in the world that naturally harbors these viruses. They don't get sick from them, but they carry them. And in the 1950s on up to the present, foot and mouth disease is one of the most economically devastating diseases of agriculture. If you get it in your country, you lose export access for cloven-hoofed animals and animal products. So they knew if they wanted to export beef from Southern Africa back to Europe or anywhere else, they had to keep foot and mouth out of the value chain. So what they decided to do was to start to build fences to keep buffalo and other wildlife over here and livestock over here. And over the ensuing decades, thousands of kilometers of fences were built, first funded by these European powers and other the colonial leadership, but over time funded by the EEC, the World Bank, other multilateral and bilateral donors. And in the context of the times, this was a very monosectoral decision. This was focused on beef agriculture. Wildlife was not considered a valuable resource in the 50s, 60s, and until relatively recently. So what I think we can look back on and say is really this was a slow motion environmental train wreck, because hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of wild animals died along these fences because they cut off the most important migratory paths in the region. And one of the things I want to emphasize today is that migration is the lifeblood of transfrontier conservation. Most of the species of concern that we're thinking about in Southern Africa need to move seasonally to access grazing, fresh water, mineral resources, breeding opportunities, to maintain long-term genetic and ecological viability. So if you cut off migrations, you're really damaging the wildlife resource. Just to give you some perspective, though, the line map is just the major fences in this part of the world. And pick your favorite species. If you're a wildebeest and you want to move across this region, you're not going to be able to do it. Obviously, wildlife doesn't care about international boundaries, but fences obstruct what had been historically vast movements, again, over space and time. The color photograph is just an aerial image. Those are two maintenance roads along a double cordon fence, just to give you appreciation for the sense of scale, the vastness of this fencing infrastructure. And here's an example of a double cordon fence. If they're maintained, they do what they were designed to do. They stop the movements of animals. So that's what I sort of consider the environmental bad news. But I want to pivot, hopefully, to the rest of our session to what I consider the good news. Today, nature-based activities, nature-based tourism contributes as much or more to the gross domestic product, to the GDP of the SADC countries, as livestock agriculture, forestry, and fisheries combined. That's a dramatic change in the macroeconomic picture, and one that hasn't been lost upon the heads of states of these countries, to the point where more than 20 years ago, the Peace Parks movement, the Transfrontier Conservationary movement got underway, and it was driven largely by economics, poverty alleviation. If you look at global beef flows, Africa contributes less than 1% of the global flow of beef. But when you think about ecotourism, Southern Africa really has a huge advantage. It is really Southern Africa's global competitive advantage. And the leaders, the heads of states of these countries have recognized that and have started to create these transfrontier conservation areas. Just so we're all on the same page, I realize this is a sophisticated audience. I just define a transfrontier conservation area as when two or more countries agree to rezone, if you will, across an international boundary. So a protected area in country A can be connected to a game reserve or national park protected area in country B, and wildlife movements can be restored. It's rezoning, emphasizing wildlife as a land use choice. And more than a dozen of these transfrontier conservation areas are now underway or well underway. And I tell U.S. audiences that if you add up the surface area of all these blobs that I've got on the map, these transfrontier conservation areas, it's the same as our state of New York, the state of California, and state of Texas combined. This is perhaps the biggest experiment in transfrontier terrestrial conservation in the world. And I can tell you, outside of Southern Africa, a lot of people still don't know about it. But it's been driven in many ways by economics, and I'm totally fine with that. To me, conservation is successful or can be successful if it does two main things: if it is socioculturally acceptable as a land use choice, and if it's economically rational. And I think the transfrontier conservation area movement has an opportunity to check both of those boxes. So I now want to spend the rest of our time together focused on one particular transfrontier conservation area, Casa the Kavango Zambezi. It's that amoeba-looking thing that I've got in the Africa map, and again, my America-centric map showing it overlaid over the northeastern United States to give us a sense of scale. Obviously, this is not one giant national park. TFCAs, as all of you know, are multi-use areas. There's railroads, there's agriculture, infrastructure, people, but a priority for land use is wildlife. So Casa was signed as a heads of state level treaty in 2011 among Angola, Botswana, Namibia, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. It's the largest conservation-oriented landscape in Africa, if not the world. One of the things that works to its advantage is it's relatively sparsely populated, only about 2.5 million people and their livestock. It is home to the majority of what's left of Africa's elephants, about 228,000 elephants. There are significant pressures on wildlife related to settlements, poaching, drought, fire, and fences, and other factors. And if you look at the movie, going again back to the 40s, 50s on since looking at historical records, if you look at the movie, wildlife populations have in general been declining because of impeding of migrations and human development and incursions into habitat. Although today, obviously, if you look at the snapshot, it's still spectacular wildlife in this part of the world, don't get me wrong. The other thing I should mention is that this part of the world, Southern Africa, if you look at all the climate change models, they point to an ongoing drying trend. And so that puts the region at risk. And the only adaptive mechanism wildlife, or for that matter, people and their livestock have, is to be able to move north-south. And these fences even preclude that kind of adaptive response. So I'm going to try and convince you today that the way we have chosen over historically to manage diseases, including foot and mouth, but not exclusively foot and mouth, and we'll talk more about that, actually threatens the viability of the entire concept of a transfrontier conservation area like Casa. I also want to be very clear that all of our work, and the work I'm describing is being done under my AHEAD program, Animal and Human Health for the Environment and Development, which started in 2003. I'll talk more about that later. But the premise is not to pit the livestock and wildlife sectors against each other. It's to recognize that we have to harmonize these two sectors. This is a cave painting in Botswana from about 600 AD. Cattle have been part and parcel of the landscape, of the economy, of culture for hundreds and hundreds of years. And that's something we need to recognize and, again, address this in a synergistic way. So just to recap what I call the land use conundrum, successful transfrontier conservation requires the free movement of wildlife over large geographic areas, obviously. But the historically accepted approaches to managing transboundary animal diseases, TADs for short, is to prevent movements of animals. So the vision for peace parks, for transfrontier conservation, and the approach of geographic or fence-based management of disease are fundamentally incompatible. And I will argue that sustainable livelihoods, resilient livelihoods, diversified livelihoods absolutely depend on a new paradigm. So let's look at this in more detail. This is just using examples of 3 countries from the region, Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, and you'll see groups of 3 columns in the bar graph. Each of those represents a decade, and the red line summarizes the incidence of foot and mouth outbreaks over time. And you can see in the 1970s moving into the 80s, there's a precipitous drop in the number of outbreaks of foot and mouth in these countries. Something important happened then, the introduction of local foot and mouth vaccines in Southern Africa. And so that was quite successful initially, and foot and mouth dropped precipitously. But then you can see it didn't take long into the early 1990s and on up to the present for things to get out of control. Why is that? Well, there's a few reasons. I would argue that one of the reasons is that fencing infrastructure, which was effective initially, is very, very expensive to maintain. Elephants knock down fences, people steal fencing equipment, floods damage fences, and governments today, compared to when this policy was put in place, are really strapped and really can't afford to maintain thousands of kilometers of fences. At the same time, vaccine availability is an intermittent problem. Just like with COVID, when you have a vaccine, you have to constantly make sure that it matches the field strains of virus that are circulating. And you've got to be able to vaccinate 80% or more of a herd to have a vaccine be effective. So you've got all of these challenges. And right now, I don't know how many of you are in South Africa. Obviously, this is a crisis. We have more than 1,000 outbreaks right now. That obviously it's really in the news. I would argue that, for better or for worse, this crisis represents an opportunity. And let me say more about what I mean by that. So let's go back to our CASA map. The green boundary is the outline of that amoeba, the 5 countries of CASA. And just roughly, the circles with the arrows through them are sort of some of the most important migratory paths around the wildlife dispersal areas that have been defined for CASA. And all of them are either currently, have been, or are about to be blocked by fences. But most of them are currently blocked by veterinary cordon fences. So I want to zoom in. So I'm going to zoom in. I don't know if you can see my cursor. We're going to go right into the, can you guys see my cursor, Melissa? Probably. We're going to go right into, thank you, right into the Okavango Delta. And I want to point out here in this map, the yellow and black lines are veterinary fences. Now, some of them, like the western boundary fence and these horizontal fences, actually were put in place, the Zambezi fence here, for a different disease, contagious bovine pleural pneumonia. It is not a disease that involves wildlife. It is strictly a livestock disease. But when this broke out in the mid-1990s, it was a crisis for Botswana. Hundreds of thousands of cattle were destroyed. Cattle were destroyed. And so there's a lingering fear about CBPP, contagious bovine pleural pneumonia, which still has a reservoir in parts of Angola. But there is also foot and mouth disease fence. This fence here is the northern buffalo fence. But what happened is veterinarians, with an intent to do their job, which is control animal disease, unintentionally created a giant cage here. So this is the Okavango River. Here's the Okavango Delta. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. The river's got a lot of villages along it. It's kind of an obstacle to wildlife movements in some ways. But then around the whole northern part here, Ngami land here, there is a fence. And inside this fence, there are about 18,000 elephants right now, about 16,000 people, and healthy elephant populations can grow at more than 3+% per year. This is one of the hotbeds of human-wildlife conflict in CASA, because these elephants are just symbolic, representative of many other wildlife species that are effectively stuck in this giant cage. So inadvertently, this fencing system has not only cut off migrations, but exacerbated human-wildlife conflict. So we're going to spend a bit more time on this very important example. So this is work drawing on my colleague Robin Naidu and colleagues that was published in Frontiers in Conservation Science. And this is based on years and years of GPS collar telemetry data. So I just want you to focus on this top map. This dark black here is that same pocket I was just showing you. Here's the Okavango again. Here's those fences. You see this density of black dots. Those are signals from radio collars of female elephants collared in Botswana. The red are female elephants collared in Namibia. And what you see over many years of these dots accumulating to make these solid colors is that they really outline the fences. These female elephants pretty much don't go through the fences. They're stuck. Now, this is an opening. This is the Kwando corridor, about 30 kilometers, where there is free movement of wildlife from northern Botswana here into the Zambezi region. So keep that in mind as we shift to the lower map. The lower map immediately looks different to you because this is collaring of male elephants. The black being male elephants collared in Botswana, the red being male elephants collared in Namibia. And you see a much more diffuse picture. Well, why is that? Bull elephants are much more likely to break through fences, go back and forth, and that's what you're seeing here. So there's a behavioral difference between the bulls that were collared and the females that were collared. Let's try and think about that in more detail, because we have a suspicion of what's going on. And this is, I'm at the Zambezi fence, actually, and I'm holding a steel cable, which is a standard part of the structure of these fences, all of which belong to Botswana. And even when these fences are badly damaged, that steel cable often is still standing, and it's just at the right height to block an elephant calf. And if you have a matriarchal herd, if the calves can't cross, the females aren't going to leave them behind. So we think that's what's going on, that the female elephants, they might be able to walk over it, but if they can't get their calves over, they're not going to go. And that's largely why we're seeing that giant cage effect and that exacerbation of elephants essentially being bottled up in this pressure cooker. So let's go back to the Kaza map as a reminder, and then we're going to zoom in just to remind you that this area that I'm talking about, this is that same pocket, here's the Okavango again, is really what I call the heart of Kaza. It's really at the center of Kaza. And I want to show you a different way of looking at that same telemetry data. And this is courtesy of the government of Botswana, the government of Namibia, EcoExist, and WWF. And just focus, for example, on these female elephants collared in Botswana. Again, over time, here's the clock ticking, the calendar. They're bouncing around in here like ping pong balls, and they hit the fence and they come back. So over time, these elephants appear to be stuck. You can see the red elephants, the females colored. Here's Cowdom on the Namibian side. So this is just an example of something that's happening across the landscape and affecting not just elephants, but other wildlife. So what we have is a situation where we have to acknowledge that livestock agriculture, economically, culturally, very important. Biodiversity conservation, also very important. Both of these things are needed for balanced rural development, for equity. And as I've pointed out, the situation has shifted where nature-based tourism is now critical to economic growth in SADC. Attempts to control diseases like foot and mouth geographically, meaning with fences, is now limiting livelihood opportunities. It's not working anymore. It's compromising resilience of the whole system. And we have intensifying conflict between livestock and wildlife. These two sectors have been just at loggerheads. The livestock sector blames wildlife for foot and mouth. The wildlife sector blames the livestock sector for the fences. So we need, at this livestock-wildlife interface, this One Health interface, we need solutions, right? We know the problem, we need solutions. And I would argue that the solutions that we come up with have to be able to do three things. First of all, they have to help Southern Africa's pastoralists and farmers. I want to point out that in this part of northern Botswana that I've been talking about, those farmers are really the poorest of the poor. They've never benefited from the fencing policy. They live too close to buffalo. They're in Botswana's red zone or dirty zone, and they haven't had export access. They really have not been able to make money from their livestock. But by having the fencing system, the southern part of the country, the green zone, has had preferential trade access. So we've got to think more holistically about farmers. Whatever we do to solve this problem cannot continue to threaten free-ranging wildlife the way fences does, the way fencing compromises migrations. And of course, the solution we come up with has to provide confidence to those countries who might buy beef from Southern Africa that they're not going to accidentally import foot and mouth and devastate their own agricultural sectors. As I pointed out, nobody wants to risk getting foot and mouth viruses into their agricultural systems. So to compress many, many years of work by the AHEAD program and our great partners in the region, including colleagues like the late Dr. Gavin Thompson, the virologist, we spent a number of years looking at ways to manage foot and mouth in beef that wouldn't depend on fences. And to make a very long story short, we came up with a concept we call commodity-based trade of beef. And all it does, it's actually quite simple. It focuses on the way beef is produced, on the beef value chain from farm to fork, and what we call hazard analysis, critical control points, all the steps along the way from cattle in the field to beef on your table, so that that product can't possibly move the foot and mouth disease virus. And this was based on known science. We know, for example, if you vaccinate your cattle and then you quarantine them, and then when you slaughter them, you debone them, you take out the lymph nodes, that's called deglanding, and then you hang the carcass at 2 degrees Celsius for 24 hours, the pH of that meat will shift below 6. And even if that cow happened to have foot and mouth, which is unlikely in the first place, that virus couldn't survive that process. That pH shift to 6 would kill the virus. And that we didn't invent that. That was known science. But what took us more than 10 years was to convince the OIE, now WOA, the World Organization for Animal Health, that that value chain approach, that way the cattle and the meat are processed, should be considered equivalent to fences, so that if farmers raised their cattle and vaccinated them and slaughtered them in that way, it would no longer matter whether there was a fence or whether there were even buffalo as your next door neighbor. And in 2015, through science-based advocacy in partnership with colleagues at WOA, with the African Union, with SADC Livestock Technical Committee, we were able to convince the World Animal Health Assembly in Paris to vote on a revision of what's called the Terrestrial Animal Health Code, the rules that all the world's countries follow for the trade in animals and animal products as they pertain to foot and mouth. And all the world's chief veterinary officers voted, and it was unanimous. They agreed that this value chain focused approach, commodity-based trade of beef, could be considered equivalent to using fences. And that was in 2015. And this opened up a whole new set of opportunities for the poorest of the poor farmers who live closest to wildlife. I don't have time to go into it, but we made a 20-minute film around this time called Beauty in the Beef. It's a true story focused on northern Namibia within Kaza in the Zambezi region. And it tells more of the story of both sectors. If you want to watch it, it's online for free. I'd sent the link to Melissa. It's also on our website, which I'll show you at the end. I encourage you, if you're interested, to watch it. The guidelines that we developed for how to do commodity-based trade of beef, we developed them in partnership with SADC, and now they're official SADC documents. So if you're a member of SADC, you're encouraged to look at these guidelines. It's actually quite simple. It's like a recipe of how to put this into place in your beef value chain so that you can have farmers who, up until now, for generations, going again back for many, many years, who never had access to markets, now can follow these procedures and start to get better prices for their beef in broader market access. Working with all our partners in Kaza, who are instrumental, including particularly Namibia and Botswana, in piloting commodity-based trade, this has created some just unique opportunities. So Botswana, we worked with their Department of Veterinary Services to do what we call the gap analysis, where they asked us to look again from farm to fork on all the steps in their beef value chain, particularly in northern Botswana. What could they be doing to make sure that their commodity-based trade approach was sound? And we developed this guide, which is basically a very detailed checklist of all the things that they needed to do specifically to their context. And that was a great partnership, and this document is still being used as a guide. Now, all that work focused on coming up with an alternative to fences set the stage for a next phase of collaboration between the AHEAD program, the Kaza Secretariat, and the 5 Kaza partner states. And I'm going to describe 3 phases of our program after we got all these changes related to commodity-based trade of beef. And this is where I think it gets really exciting from a conservation point of view. But none of this could have happened till we addressed the beef trade conundrum. So the next phase was phase 1, we call, of this new set of work, and that occurred during the pandemic. And because I think we just had such goodwill between our program and our colleagues in Botswana Department of Veterinary Services and the Department of Wildlife and National Parks, we were allowed to work with them to ask a question that when I was the veterinarian for Botswana in the early 1990s, it was sort of taboo. We were able to ask which fences are most damaging wildlife in Botswana and in Kaza more broadly. And we did an analysis that involved with partnerships with a number of NGOs and with the government. We looked at ground spoor. We had some fantastic sound trackers who looked at where different species were being blocked by fences the most. We did aerial surveys. We looked at historical records, and we came up with an analysis that really pinpointed the fences that are most damaging to migration in Kaza. After we had that information, we were able to move into phase 2, where we were able to ask, what if some of those fences weren't there? This was the quintessential question. Were they really doing what they were put in place to do going back those many years? In other words, would the risks of livestock disease change if some of those fences were taken down? I'm going to answer that question shortly for you. Phase 3 is where we are now, we're working with the communities in that same part of northern Botswana to get their perspectives. What do they think about fences? What has been the experience of village elders before and after the fences were put in place? How are their livelihoods benefiting from livestock versus ecotourism? Are there things that could be better? And there are. And the community surveys, I'll talk more about them, are very important to inform how decisions will be made over the next few years. But all of this three-phase project is meant to have impacts that involve reducing conflicts with wildlife, reducing the risk of disease, increase benefits to local communities from the green economy, and all of this will be ideally underpinned by increasing connectivity, restoring migratory options for the key species of wildlife. So that's what I want to focus in on now. So this is that phase one. This is the report where we were able to assess the fences and which ones were most damaged. I'm going to give you the top line summary. This is that same amoeba-looking map that I showed you before, but I've inserted to scale northern Botswana. So if you looked at the Kaza boundary, it kind of runs along here. But there's three colors here in the fences. The aquamarine are those fences that we found were most problematic from a wildlife point of view. Those are the ones that are really blocking important wildlife dispersal areas. So you'll remember from, if you're familiar with Kaza, this is the Kwando River WDA, allowing these very important historical movements. And over here, this is the Ngamiland Kaudum WDA, wildlife dispersal area. The dark blue are fences that are also problematic for wildlife, but they're denser populations of people and cattle, and we delineated them as dark blue because they're going to be more challenging to deal with, because if you took them down tomorrow, there'd be a lot of transboundary movements of livestock. The red fences are fences that, we agreed with the government of Botswana that they just can't be messed with right now. They're too important for managing the green zone, for managing foot and mouth disease-free export of beef, and so those are off the table. But those are the most important fences that we were able to hone in on. I want to take you now to phase two, because based on phase one, phase two, which we just completed 2 years ago, was to look at those fences and look at what would be the disease risk if they weren't there. And we describe this as an emphasis on the Botswana-Namibia border, because that's where the most important fences are. Well, what did phase two tell us? And this was led by Dr. Laura Rosen, who's the Kaza Animal Health Sub-Working Group epidemiologist working with the AHEAD program, and a number of other colleagues, as well as experts from departments of veterinary services, the Director of Veterinary Services in Botswana and Namibia, respectively, experts from Botswana Vaccine Institute. This was a holistic analysis with governmental partners, co-authors, NGO partners, really robust. And what we were able to demonstrate, again, using a qualitative risk assessment, a formal process, that not all the vet sections that we were focusing on are still serving their disease control purpose. As I've pointed out, they're somewhat permeable in places because of elephant and other damage. And we were looking at the status quo versus what if they weren't there at all. And what the most important conclusion from this analysis was that if the most damaging fence sections from a wildlife point of view were removed, there would be no increase in the risks of livestock disease. That's somewhat astounding, but we were able to demonstrate it using good epidemiology, and that's in the report. And furthermore, we were able to demonstrate that by increasing the number of communities herding their livestock, we could do a better job than fences can in mitigating disease risk. This sounds very simple, and in many ways it is, but if you know the history of northern Botswana, herding has sort of fallen by the wayside because people really weren't able to get good prices for their beef. It really wasn't, people didn't want to invest in the labor of herding their cattle. A lot of cattle wander around. If you're wandering around as a cow, there's a higher chance you're going to run into a buffalo and contract foot and mouth disease. As a matter of fact, if you herd, it has an extraordinary number of co-benefits. So herding cattle leads to healthier livestock in better condition. It's a prerequisite to participating in commodity-based trade of what we are now calling wildlife-friendly beef. This has recently led to preferential beef pricing from local tourism operators in northern Botswana. So for example, if you are now using this commodity-based trade approach and you're herding your cattle, you're putting them in bomas at night so that there's not as much conflict with lions, the villages that are doing that are not losing any more losing any more livestock to lions. Some of them were losing 30% a year. Well, the tourism companies like Wilderness recognize that this is in their best interest too. They're paying the farmers a premium on that beef and using it for staff rations in their camps. Ideally, when the beef quality goes up, we'll be seeing tourists eating that beef as well. But the fact is, wilderness didn't want to see lions continuing to be poisoned and shot. And by using this herding approach, the conflict between lions led by our partner Claws, those of you who know the NGO Claws, are the fact that we have this virtuous cycle now where the private sector is participating is fantastic. As I mentioned earlier, you need to have good vaccine coverage in order to prevent diseases like foot and mouth. Well, if you're herding your cattle, suddenly they're available when it's vaccine time. Foot and mouth vaccines have to happen in northern Botswana 3 times a year. When we get all the cattle herded, when the veterinarians show up, they can all get vaccinated. We can get to that 80% plus threshold. The cattle can all get their mandatory ear tags, which is also a problem if you're not herding. As I mentioned, lower losses from predators, less conflicts with buffalo and other wildlife, less cattle theft. The cattle theft is a huge issue right now, as many of you know in Kaza. And if you're herding your cattle, that makes them less of a target for livestock theft. And overall, this professional herding that we're instituting is based on good rangeland management. It's based on grazing plans, which is good for restoration of grasslands and also enhances soil carbon sequestration. So we've got this almost magical value added of herding that is better than fencing and addresses a lot of the key problems that the poorest of the poor communities have been facing. So this is a map from that phase 2 study, and I just want to spend a few minutes on it. Again, it's that same area I was showing you before, and I want to hone in on the green. So this is the Zambezi fence. Here is the Zambezi region of Namibia, formerly the Caprivi. Here's Kaudum, here's Nainai. This is that border between Namibia and Botswana. And these green fences are those fence lines, and these were light blue in the phase 1 study, but the green means that the governments of Botswana and Namibia have tentatively agreed that they would consider removing them if we can get all the 14 villages, the communities in this part, NG11, NG13, along the Okavango River, etc., to reinstate herding. So basically, there's at the validation meeting for the phase 2 analysis, we came to an agreement that if we could get communities herding, given all the benefits herding brings, that these fences could come down. Obviously, that would open up this Kwando River wildlife dispersal area more, and that box of elephants, that pressure cooker, would be relieved. We believe that a lot of these elephants would restore their historically normal movements on into Zambia and Angola. Over time, there'd be elephants going back and forth, but we believe net, there would be a lowering of the pressure. The yellow are parts of the Zambezi fence, and this is the northern buffalo fence. This is 62 kilometers. This is 35 kilometers. The yellow couldn't come down unless a few other conditions were met. Just as an example, there are still cattle in Bobata National Park. The government of Namibia is trying to get them out of Bobata. They're not legally supposed to be there. If the government of Namibia does get the cattle out of Bobata, Botswana has said that maybe this yellow portion could also come down. But with cattle right here, that increases the disease risk from Botswana's point of view. Now, you'll notice on this side, this is that western boundary fence. This is Botswana's fence, but it's orange. It's not green or yellow. And that's, again, out of concerns about contagious bovine pleural pneumonia, which, as I mentioned, is still in parts of Angola. Once in a while, you see outbreaks in northern Namibia. The agreement that was hammered out really was, let's use proof of concept here. Let's see if we can get these groups herding, these communities herding, work on these fences. And if we're successful, we can revisit CBPP management and opportunities for opening up the Ngamiland Kaudum WDA, which is very important. This is a very important fence in terms of blocking wildlife movements. But the agreement has been, let's focus on the lower hanging fruit for now. So that's what we're doing, again, in collaboration with our government partners. What does that look like? This brings us to that phase 3. This is a picture of a meeting almost exactly a year ago that we had in northern Botswana with the 14 chiefs of the 14 villages on everything I've been talking to you about just now. And one of the really great things about this all-day meeting was, it was led by governments, by Botswana's, by government departments, the Department of Veterinary Services, the Department of Wildlife and National Parks. And I think we were all a little bit nervous that the chiefs were going to say, no, you've got to refix all the fences. We don't want them to come down. They're too important. And what we learned from the chiefs, perhaps not surprisingly in retrospect, was that they all said, yeah, the fences aren't doing anything. They're in terrible shape. We know that. So let's look at these other options you've presented. They were quite excited to reinstill herding, what we call strategic herding. You can call it herding for health, the reherd model. But there was real enthusiasm for this because there was a recognition that business as usual wasn't working. There was also a recognition that, as I mentioned before, that livestock theft is a growing issue. And our phase 2 study did sort of point to the idea that fences really aren't going to stop livestock theft. If you're a livestock theft thief, you have a targeted goal. You're either going to go through an existing gap in the fence, or you're going to cut the fence as you're stealing cattle. But there's a perception, and it's important to recognize among some of the community members in northern Botswana, that if some of these fence sections are removed, it will increase livestock theft. And that's something we have to address and work with legal, the legal community, work with law enforcement, Botswana Defense Force, etc. This is a real problem because we were focusing on fences and their perceptions in disease control. We have a new problem where they're now tied to a resurgence of livestock theft. So that's just a part of what we have to work on. But these chiefs at the end of this meeting agreed to let us then do a survey of community members across the Eastern Panhandle, the 14 villages, which we've just completed. We're in the process of writing it up, asking, as I mentioned, about perceptions, about life before fences, after fences. What are they doing? How would you feel if they weren't there? How are you benefiting from livestock versus wildlife? How could things be improved? Very, very informative answers, I'll say. And again, some community members thought the fences must stay. Some understood that, it was time for a new paradigm, that business as usual wasn't working. And everybody wanted livestock theft to be addressed by the appropriate authorities. So because we have agreement in principle from most of these communities to reinstill this culture of herding, we're working with CLAWS, as well as the NGO EcoExist, another great partner based in northern Botswana, to work with these communities to get roughly 15,000 cattle under this herding paradigm. And very quickly, the plan is to do it in 3 stages. It's already happening. There are several villages that CLAWS has already been working in, and there are trained herders selected from the villages. They get special training on all land use management, animal husbandry, grazing patterns, all the things you need to be a good herder. And then they manage certain groups of cattle. So we're doing it in phase 1 here, and these black dots are cattle crushes. The hot heat map is sort of density of cattle. Then we want to move to this part, to this corner here for phase 2. And when we're all done, we'll have basically 3 phases covering all 14 villages. This is going to take at least 5 years, about 5 years. That's the plan. I want to emphasize that all the analysis I've explained to you, that had which fences are most problematic, is done under the auspices of the CASA Animal Health Subworking Group. One of the things my AHEAD program does is we shepherd the Animal Health Subworking Group, which is a forum under the official CASA structures where we bring the partner states' veterinarians, the livestock vets, the wildlife vets, the departments of animal production together to co-plan. And the findings that I've shared with you were actually completely reinforced by a different working group in CASA, the elephant working group. They did an analysis just from an elephant point of view, and they identified the exact same pinch points, the fences that needed to come down to restore elephant movements, and they have put that out in their plans, and they were adopted at the Kasane Heads of State Elephant Summit in 2019. So the idea of connectivity has been, officially adopted as core to the goals of CASA. Without it, I would argue, CASA will fail. Protected areas are critical, but if they're not connected over the long term, wildlife populations are going to continue to decline. So we have this great synergy between the CASA Elephant Subworking Group, the Animal Health Subworking Group, obviously summits like the Elephant Summit. And this reinforces how the science is getting into the higher levels of decision makers. So I've mentioned, obviously that kind of meeting, working with farmers, working with, technocrats, professionals in departments of veterinary services and departments of wildlife. This is a discussion I was having with former President Masisi of Botswana and Minister of the Environment Karang. It's important to me to also try and get to the highest levels of heads of state so that the types of decisions we're talking about, reversing decades of policy, you have to have a bottom-up and a top-down response so that hopefully the ideas meet in the middle. I haven't gotten to meet with President Boko, the new president of Botswana yet, but I certainly hope to do that. We are in contacts with high levels of the ministries of both agriculture and environment. We have good working relationships at that level, which is critical and mirror the good relationships that our partners and ourselves have with the communities, the chiefs, the farmers, whose lives and livelihoods are really depending on us to help them find a new way forward. I also want to emphasize that we publish this work. It's not just in the reports, but also in the peer-reviewed literature. I've given Melissa links to these documents. There's one paper from 2025 in CABI One Health about the history of this work. More recently, just this year, we published a peer-reviewed paper on the epidemiological analysis demonstrating why the key fence sections that are blocking wildlife actually could be removed without increasing livestock disease risk, that we have co-authors from the governments of Botswana and Namibia, which is very exciting. So I feel like we're trying to check all the boxes to have that buy-in from all the right stakeholders to shift the policy that is really, really important to the future of obviously poverty alleviation, but also transfrontier conservation. So the next 5 years, as I explained, is these phases. This phase 3, where we're working with communities to reinstate this culture of herding. We have a proposal that we are actively fundraising for. It's going to cost roughly $10 to $11 million over the next 5 years. It sounds like a lot, but honestly, for $2 million a year, we're employing a large number of local community members, training them, creating new job opportunities, expanding the green economy, elephant-friendly enterprises, working on human-lion conflict mitigation over a vast area. So we look at this really as an investment in transforming the system into one that's failing both people and wildlife, into one that is truly resilient and sustainable. So if any of you from African parks or elsewhere want to chat about any of this and partnering on this type of work, I told Melissa I'm happy to set up meetings in the weeks to come to talk about more direct engagement, because I think it's really now or never. The infrastructure threats to CASA are very, very real, and it's not just fences. We've got new railroads coming in, being proposed. We've got growth of human populations. We've got a lot of threats to connectivity that I think we have a limited window of opportunity now. And frankly, with the political will that I'm seeing in CASA, and particularly with the key governments in Botswana and Namibia, I think this is the time to act. So with that, again, all this work has been done under the auspices of the HEAD program that we launched actually in South Africa at the IUCN World Parks Congress in 2003. And we're a facilitator. I think of myself as a biodiplomat. My job in the HEAD program has been to bring sectors together, the livestock and wildlife sectors in countries, but also between countries, literally often breaking bread. I found that by creating that, a mechanism where people can start to get to know each other, they're not just email addresses, they're faces. People have a beer, they have a meal, and they start to build trust. They're all charged with managing the same landscapes from different perspectives. But if we can get people to better understand each other's technical challenges and also their worst fears, then we can work to solve those problems. And that's really what we've been doing over many, many years across a landscape like CASA to try and get these sectors to basically break down the barriers that have been between them so that they can solve problems collaboratively. All this work is documented at cornell-ahead.org. I've got all 20 years worth of reports for those of you who can't sleep at night. And I just want to thank everybody again for this opportunity. And our broader program at Cornell is at wildlife.cornell.edu if you're interested. I hope we have time for questions and discussion after the second presentation. And again, really appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.